Thank you very much, Tom. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. Center. My name is Sarah Morif. I'm with the International Energy Agency. We're an intergovernmental organization working with countries around the world for secure and sustainable clean energy transitions. And I'm very, very honored to moderate the session here that's been organized by the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure with USAID. So the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI, was created at the 2019 Climate Action Summit, and it's a global partnership that's really seeking to address resilience, disaster and climate resilience and infrastructure for sustainable development around the world. And in 2 short years, it's already grown to include 27 countries and 7 international organizations, and is doing work across the world. So today we're going to be talking about the very important issue of clean energy transitions and how those intersect with challenges of resilience. So we're here at COP26, a place where countries are working to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, which involves really transitioning to new ways of producing and consuming energy. And we've seen a lot of announcements, we've seen a lot of commitments in that direction. But all of that is happening in the context of a world that's warming, with changing climate patterns, precipitation patterns, different heat waves, much more frequent weather events. Just this morning, there was a very interesting event here at this pavilion looking at how fire risk has changed that NASA presented, which was very interesting. And we've seen that these types of events are direct risks to energy infrastructure. And in some cases, particularly electricity infrastructure, which is relevant given the increased importance of electricity in the context of clean energy transitions and decarbonized electricity. So we're going to really look at, we're going to have some members from CDRI on our panel today. And we're going to be really looking at policies and what can help countries as they navigate these challenges and as they think about the resilience of their infrastructure in the context of their transitions. So what the way the session will run is we'll have a keynote address, and very pleased to welcome Administrator Samantha Power of USAID, who will give us a keynote address. And then we'll move on to our panel with Mr. Kamal Kishore, who's a member secretary of India's National Disaster Management Authority and a co-chair of CDRI's executive committee. We'll also have Mr. James Larsen, climate coordinator at the and Deputy Secretary at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet from Australia. And virtually, we're very, very pleased to welcome Vice Minister Francisco Lopez from Chile. And so after our opening remarks, I'll be asking just a few questions to the panel and getting their views. So without further ado, I'd welcome Administrator Powers.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction and for your leadership at IEA. My past life reveals itself. IEA, as it evolved this year from producing the outlook that everybody reads to the roadmap that everybody needs. It is your institution's analysis that has helped paint a vision of a net zero 2050 that we all need to take inspiration from. I also want to thank Minister Singh and the Government of India for hosting this event and for their leadership in convening the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. The U.S. is proud to be a founding member of this India-led coalition, and we will continue to be a champion of its efforts to raise private and public sector financing for infrastructure that can withstand climate shocks. President Biden has made both public and private sector investment in infrastructure a key part of his emergency plan for adaptation and resilience, PREPARE. But today we're speaking about a very particular kind of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and the need to make sure it can stand up to the climate shocks that are increasingly upon us. When talking about energy resilient infrastructure, so much attention is focused on the future. But when describing just how necessary it is helpful actually to look to the past. In 1955, as the sun was setting on the British Empire, construction began on the Kariba Dam, a massive project in what was then northern Rhodesia. Nearly 2,000 feet wide, this dam would provide power to copper mines. And when it was designed, it was intended to be impervious to 1 in 10,000 year flooding. The designers, though, based their calculations on only 3 decades of river flow data. And that mistake became painfully apparent in 1957, when the site, still under construction, experienced a flood bigger than that 1 in 10,000 year flood. The waters quickly drowned the construction. Eventually they subsided, but the planners learned their lesson. Soon they expanded their plans, but in 1958, the very next rainy season, the waters rose even higher and the dam was hit by a flood twice as large as the previous one. The Kariba Dam was eventually completed, and it provides over 1,800 megawatts to both countries while holding the world's largest reservoir at bay. But today, a changing climate and low rainfall threatens to shut down the dam's power production, with water levels 12% of its typical capacity. Vexingly, flooding is still a threat too, as heavy rainfall could refill it and potentially cause it to collapse. Needless to say, we want all the things we build to stand up to climate change, all our buildings and bridges and roads and facilities. Yet the infrastructure that powers our lives is decidedly different. When our energy infrastructure functions, it has the ability to propel human productivity and lift people not just out of energy poverty, but out of extreme poverty. When absent, it chokes economic activity and limits pathways for people, especially women, to earn a living. Today, nearly half the population of sub-Saharan Africa still lacks electricity, a shocking fact when you consider 90% of the world's population has access to electricity. So we need new power generating infrastructure desperately, but we also need our energy generating infrastructure to be renewable so it doesn't emit greenhouse gases and contribute to further heating. Many wealthy countries, the US included, are currently trying to make carbon-dependent infrastructure more efficient. But other countries can build green from the start, tapping into their considerable access to renewable resources like solar, wind, hydropower, and geothermal to drastically increase renewable energy production. In fact, according to Sarah's roadmap, if the world is to get to net zero emissions by 2050, then 2/3 of the total energy supply in 2050 must come from renewables. Electricity will also have to be the core of our energy system. Electric cars, electric trucks and transport, electric heaters and air pumps. We must become far more reliant on electricity, which means electricity must become far more dependable. That's why we need renewable energy infrastructure to be resilient to that changing climate. Today, energy disruptions due to natural disaster or poor maintenance cost low and middle income countries between $390 and $647 billion every single year. So as the world raises finance to invest in clean energy systems of the future, these systems must withstand the impacts of climate change. And according to the Global Commission on Adaptation, the return is more than worth the investment. The benefits of making new infrastructure more climate resilient outweigh the cost by as much as 4-to-1. Supporting the development of renewable and resilient energy infrastructure will boost economic development, especially for the most marginalized. It will improve energy security and cut down on disruptions, and it will protect both critical infrastructure and our planet. To help realize this vision of resilience, USAID has embarked on a $9 million partnership with Miyamoto International, a world leader in developing disaster and climate resilient infrastructure around the world to support CDRI across its 3 objectives. Together, we're investing in technical support and capacity building for partner governments and utilities to set policies and adopt standards and certifications for new infrastructure. Experts will support the development and implementation of new projects in the energy sector to support resilient infrastructure. We're also supporting research efforts and helping build a global store of knowledge, documenting and learning from infrastructure failures, as well as innovative approaches. And third, we're strengthening public and private sector engagement to turn climate resilient infrastructure from a niche focus to a booming civil engineering sector in countries all around the world. That transformation really is key. These efforts will help the coalition deliver sustainable green development outcomes for its member nations, a growing number of member nations. It will increase knowledge transfer, develop global and regional standards for resilient infrastructure, and ultimately save lives and livelihoods. As we design the dams and the batteries of tomorrow, the solar farms and wind fields and geothermal plants that will fuel us for generations, we can't afford to base our predictions on short-sighted data or optimistic outlooks. We have the climate and forecasting data that the Kariba Dam's original planners lacked. We have technologies that can strengthen our infrastructure in the face of fiercer shocks. And we have decades of experience as we witness resilience, successes, and our failures. Together we can build a future of renewable, resilient power that keeps carbon out of our skies while keeping our lights on. That's the future that the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is working to deliver, and the United States is committing to realizing it. Thank you so much.
For those very, very inspiring words and a very clear depiction of the challenge of what we've learned and of the things we need to move towards. I thought that was very concisely delivered. And so to start off our panel, I would like to just give each of our panelists 2 minutes to perhaps say a little bit about where they sit in terms of this issue, how they see it, and just some introductory thoughts on this issue. We'll go in the order of Mr. Kishore, Mr. Larsen, and then Mr. Lopez.
Thanks very much. It's indeed a very topical issue, and Administrator Power's keynote has really set the tone for our discussions. She gave the example of Kariba Dam, but more recently, I know of one airport which took pride in the fact that it was 100% on renewables on a solar farm, and 2 years in a row, all those panels went underwater, and it's no longer powered totally by renewables. So I think the issue is really important, that while we expand solar, while we expand wind, we make sure that these power systems of the future are resilient themselves. So I just want to make 3 points about what we need to do. One, I think that it is really important that we bring to bear the best possible analytics in planning these systems. You know, as Administrator Power said, our climate information analytics is like several orders of magnitude better than what it was when Kariba Dam was being built. So let's bring that to bear. The second very important thing is that as the energy systems transform, their governance also is changing. You know, how the energy systems of the future will be managed when they are more decentralized, how the systems of accountability will work. A traditional system of, power delivery, has matured over more than 100 years. What would it take for new power governance systems to reach that level of maturity and have that system of accountability so that you know who's responsible for maintaining continuity of supplies? I think that's a deeper issue which we need to go sort of more in depth into. The third point is that for most of the world, while we are expanding solar and wind and other renewable systems, the standard setting and regulation is barely keeping pace with the growth. There is massive growth, but I think on standards and regulations, we could do a lot better. It's not just engineering standards, it's in terms of, what kind of panels, what kind of wind engineering, but also performance standards of the management system surrounding around it. Are the solar engineers, are the wind engineers as regulated as the traditional engineers who work in the power sector? So I think these are the three things: better risk analytics, look at what it means for risk governance in power sector of the future, and let's see how we can make sure that standards and regulations keep pace with the growth in this sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. James Larsen, Climate Coordinator for the Prime Minister in Australia. Look, a couple of observations from me. The first is that Australia has experienced, I think, in recent years what it's like to be at the forefront of climate challenges and disasters, bushfires, floods, and a wide variety of incidents which have impacted very dramatically on our own energy resilience. I would say also in our experience engaging particularly with Pacific Island countries, we see time and time again changes in climate change impacts which are impacting on the capacity of those countries to provide for their energy security. The consequence of Australia's direct experience in recent years of really quite dramatic environmental changes and its impact on our energy resilience has caused us to think a very great deal about the measures we need to put in place to build the capacity for various systems to kick in. We have a very high uptake, for example, of rooftop solar in Australia, the highest in the world. However, that is obviously a strongly positive thing in many respects, but in a variety of other ways it actually impacts adversely on our existing energy systems. And a great deal of work being undertaken by our regulators in this space is how do you manage those solar power inputs into our system alongside our established grid. I think we also look, when you look at sort of major bushfires, major excessive heat periods or major floods, we are seeing time and time again the breakdown of our established and traditional energy systems. There are three things that I think we really need to focus on. The first is ensure that we are continuing to invest in the development of technology which is going to help us address these challenges. The second is to ensure the deployment of that technology in ways which will ensure continuity of supply and assurance of supply, notwithstanding a variety of different circumstances. And thirdly, I think it is very much up to developed economies, including economies like Australia, to ensure that less developed economies have the support, have the finance, and have that technology made available to them to ensure that we are putting in place systems which give confidence in those economies of continuity of energy supply, notwithstanding changing circumstances. I look at the experience of Australia in working with Papua New Guinea in particular, but also the Solomon Islands. We are very actively engaged in their electricity supply systems and the work there to upgrade and reinforce their systems. But there's a very great deal of work to do. And those two locations are two of a number of areas where Australia is very focused. We've recently increased our climate finance to $2 billion for the 2020 to 2025 period. That's a doubling of our climate finance. 70% of our climate finance currently goes on adaptation measures, and a good proportion of that is invested in energy resilience. And that will continue to be a key priority and absolutely essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have Vice Minister Lopez? Thank you.
Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the USA government for hosting this event today and allowing us to participate remotely. Chile is glad to be part of this session, sharing us our experience in energy transition and the incorporation of disaster and climate risk in these transitions. The energy sector is leading Chile's decarbonization plan as we commit to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. In April 2021, our country increased the ambition through an updated NDC, including an emissions budget for the 2020-2030 decade, reaching peak emissions by 2025 and setting an intermediate emissions target for 2030. In order to comply with this goal, Chile has set 4 separate complementary pathways that supports the decarbonization of our economy, considering to clean our electricity generation capacity by increasing the amount of renewable energy. Our aims to achieve 80% renewable generation before 2030. In 2018, it was 44%. Second, the withdrawal of coal-fired power plants by 2040. Third, the promotion of energy efficiency, mainly in constructions, appliances, and industrial equipment. Fourth, to replace fossil fuels with electricity into the transport sector, aiming to have 100% electric vehicle sales of light and medium vehicles by 2035, and the development of a green hydrogen industry. Our goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 is a challenge, given the need to decouple of economic growth from energy consumption and reduce our dependence on the imported fossil fuels. However, achieving this goal will imply positive economic effects and present net benefits for over $31 billion by 2050, and the investment opportunities account for almost $50 billion, with the saving in operational management up to more than $80 billion. The challenge and the opportunity we have for taking climate change through the energy transition will clearly not be exempt from the climate and disaster risks, especially for Chile, which have been highlighted to be the country with the highest risk of disaster in the OECD, according to the World Risk Report 2021. Apart from this risk comes after our geographical and geological characteristics, as well as the highest volcanic activity we have in Chile, given its location on the eastern side of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and one of the highest seismic activities in the world. All in that, we are exposed to diverse natural disasters, threats as earthquakes, tsunamis, and tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, floods, and mass removals. Likewise, our territory is exposed to events and an anthropic origin. All those treated alter our ecosystem and compromise the way of life of our communities and our energy transition. This is why we need to disaster and climate risks into our national policies in order to develop our resilient energy sector.
Thank you very much for those opening points. And to go to my first question to the panel, I mean, most of you did mention specific policy issues that you really had to think about measures that are needed for resilience. You need to integrate these considerations into your national policy, that we need to adapt regulations, governance systems. And so my question is really on digging a little bit deeper when we're thinking about infrastructure, the resilience of the infrastructure. What kind of particularly challenges have you seen from your country's perspectives, and what kind of policies, what kind of measures have been put in place or are planned, or have been key things that you would like to mention and share? So perhaps we'll go in the same order.
I would point to two things. Number one is that just as we plan solar or wind or offshore wind and use data to see the viability of solar in terms of number of sunshine hours, wind speeds, etc., I think there is a need for having climate analytics on the risk side also available to developers. And in that, there's a big role to be played by the public sector. There's a lot of investment coming into renewables, private investment. It is really important that governments make climate analytics available as a public good for investors who are investing in renewables in the energy systems of the future. And that work requires a lot of tedious, unattractive, hard work of digitizing last 150 years of data, improving your observational network. No one gives you credit for doing that groundwork, very boring, tedious, hard work, but that is essentially the building block of making it happen. The second thing is that renewables require resources such as land. And there is a tendency to go to land which is the cheapest, which is which can't be used for anything else. I think land use planning or offshore asset planning should be at the same level of sophistication that we use master planning for our cities. So do not relegate your solar farms to the worst possible sites and think that it will take care of itself. It requires planning over the long horizon. It's not just something which you do for the next 5 years while your solar farms are coming up. So I think these are the two things I would say, that making available climate analytics, doing the tedious work of putting together the building blocks as a public good, take the whole sort of resource planning, particularly land resource planning, seriously, and make it in a, we know about risk-informed land use planning for earthquakes, for floods. We have to do risk-informed land use planning for renewables as well.
From an Australian perspective, I think there are two key elements to this. The first, and I agree absolutely with the point about data. So data is key. So we have our electricity sector climate information project, which provides detailed data and guidance for climate change risk management, including planned high-resolution climate projections out to 2100. So I think data is going to be key, and really, as Samantha Power mentioned before, the examples we have of earlier projects where we relied on some data, but it wasn't enough data. We need more data, and we need to make that data available, both obviously in our own advanced economies, but we need to make sure that we build into our systems mechanisms which are going to be ensuring that data accessibility and availability for less economically advantaged countries. And the Australian National Resilience and Adaptation Statement, just released prior to this COP, specifically includes a regional component, i.e. for countries in our Asia-Pacific region. So it's not just a domestic document, and it's particularly for that purpose. I think the second element which we would look to in Australia as a key to addressing this resilience challenge is don't rely on a single national grid. We need to look more carefully about, okay, what is the potential for microgrids? And there is some really interesting work being done on that. And what is the potential for regional and sub-regional hubs? And so in the Australian context, we're looking at the establishment of renewable energy zones, so that efficient transmission investment can be made into transport energy to customers in particular zones, so that you have less reliance on a total a national grid. And Australia's experience in this, because we have an extremely large landmass and a very dispersed population, we have a very, very spread out and thin grid. And so the critical key there is to make sure you have measures in place to provide backup and assurance, and not complete reliance on that one single grid. I would say also there's a lot of work being done in Australia on how we deliver through the private sector and through private sector finance renewable energy to remote locations in our region. That is led by the Private Infrastructure Development Group. We're doing work in remote parts of the Philippines and obviously in parts of the South Pacific, where in some respects those very remote locations are not so dissimilar to remote locations in Australia. Thank you.
In 2021, our government published the National Strategy Plan for 2020 and 2030, with national policy for risk reductions to work in increasing the resilience to natural disaster and reliability on the country's infrastructure, considering the effects of the climate change. The strategy plan constitutes a guideline to update in a matter of disaster risk management, DRM, for public and private stakeholders. The strategy considers the territorial particularities and diversity of the community through the execution of strategic action from a multi-sectoral point of view. Furthermore, it sets the goals and actions with deadlines for stakeholders that are required to be executed at disaster risk reduction within the framework of sustainable development to which Chile aspires. We are ensuring the safety and reliability of the new infrastructure, developing and implementing this national strategic plan, which incorporates the key findings of international recommendations as to the central framework to disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030, integrated with the international agendas such as the Paris Agreement, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as the new urban agenda, Habitat 3, among others. In this way, we are considering the specific of our country. Our strategic plan 2020-2030 will contribute to a safer country through the reduction of vulnerabilities and the strengthening of the resilience to disaster. In the Ministry of Energy, we have recently published and updated our long-term energy policy for the next 30 years, with a citizen participation process as one of these fundamental pillars because the energy challenge is no longer a purely technical problem. Our energy policy considers clean definitions to improve the way we design and construct our energy grid, considering the energy resilience and the future challenge of the transformative process of going towards a sustainable development of our country. Regarding the challenge of developing countries to decrease disparities of the access to energy, we improve the performance standards with the focus on end customers. In 2017, the technical standard for service quality for distribution will set the pace of decreasing the support interruption rates, deciding across all citizens, ensuring that the end of consumer have a quality service standard in accordance with our development. On the other hand, developed countries with a high level of resilience in current power infrastructure system are related to accelerating the transition to cleaner sources, achieving carbon neutrality as soon as possible while sharing the experience with the developing countries. Therefore, institutions as APEC, World Bank, or CDRI, in which experience is shared, are and serve as knowledge transfer hubs.
Thank you very much for those last points, which lead us a little bit to the next set of questions. I think it was really useful to have the data point really highlighted because we really do see that in certain regions, especially say in sub-Saharan Africa, where planning is made extremely difficult because of a lack of historical data being transcribed, being able to use, and therefore not having these kinds of high-resolution models that Mr. Larsen was talking about being available, and that makes a really big difference to planning. And the kinds of things Mr. Lopez was talking about, integrating resilience into national energy planning in terms of grid design, all those things do require quite a lot of that data. So really interesting to hear those specific examples. I think the land use planning is an interesting point that perhaps isn't thought of as naturally. So thank you for bringing that up. It leads a bit to my second question, especially Mr. Larsen. You talked about regional approaches. We know countries are transitioning, having clean energy transitions at different rates. They're doing it in different ways because of their different circumstances. And how can countries, but also international support, multilateral development banks or other international development support, how can they really help countries in terms of going ahead to future-proof systems, sort of making sure those SDG goals are met, and particularly perhaps LDCs did some of the countries as well, Mr. Larsen was mentioning. So a few thoughts on how that experience with that international support and views on that, how that can happen. Let's keep the same order while we're at it.
So I would say three things. Number one, I think this whole notion of building resilience into renewable energy systems is now gaining traction. If you went around these pavilions, there are examples of emerging technologies such as floating solar panels, which would be resilient to impacts of flooding. So I think if international agencies could do some sort of a marketplace of the new innovation that is coming up in this space, I think that would be a very useful thing. The second thing is we're talking a lot about risk finance in general, but what about risk finance creating risk pools for renewable energy systems? Can we, ensure or create a risk pool of all the solar panels or solar energy systems of a certain magnitude in India, for example? Is there something we can do for that? And a sort of corollary of that is we need to really have performance standards there. Say in coastal areas, can we say that our solar power systems will be such that if there's a disruption due to a cyclone or a hurricane, it will be restored in 3 days. So that's a measurable target of resilience, that this is the level of service we deliver in high hazard prone areas. And the third thing, which is a very important thing, and I don't know whether it's really something that fits with the international agencies, which is about people's participation. Infrastructure is not about big infrastructure companies. It is about people, and people's participation in resilience building activities is much more possible in renewable systems, which are more decentralized, closer to the people than the traditional power systems. But we have not begun to have that conversation yet. So I would ask for a people's movement in making sure, and it also means that you, while sort of advocating for renewable, you also highlight its vulnerabilities, and take people along in this movement of building resilience into the energy systems of the future.
So I think there is a very real challenge that less developed and least developed countries, particularly with small populations, will get left behind in this space. And so I think we need to think really proactively about how we make sure we are taking those communities and those countries with us in this transition. Key, obviously, is going to be the availability of finance. We're working with the Commonwealth, Baroness Scotland, on how can we ramp up the work to support accessibility of finance to smaller, less developed countries in more broadly across the renewables and energy transition space. But energy resilience is obviously going to have to be key to that. I think also if you look at the point that was just made about that being able to step in quickly and restore power systems. So we have we've just developed a humanitarian capability for the Pacific called Power On, which sets aside technical experts and technical expertise, which will have the capacity to fly in and restore power services within, or the objective anyway, restore power services after a crisis, most normally a cyclone, of course, within 48 hours. So I think we need to be thinking really creatively about what are the resources that we are going to put aside to make sure that they're very, very readily accessible to respond to crises. And of course, what is the technology that we're developing, and what is the deployment mechanism that we're putting in place, which is going to provide the greatest assurance in the first place by building the infrastructure. But that infrastructure is going to go down, and we need to be there, able rapidly to come in and fix it up as required.
Thank you. While I was talking a few minutes ago, there was a small shake in Chile, 4.1 in the central zone. So it's something very common in our country. And to leave no behind, advanced countries may support the least developed country through participation to institutions such as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructures, the DRI. Platforms such as the CDRI promote cooperation and technical support between countries to increase resilience and infrastructure, which in turn improves response to disaster and its true support for recovery. Therefore, we are proud to be a member of our country of your institution. Additionally, as a governmental institution, we must be in contact with our peers at a frequent rate. For this reason, we are organizing shared knowledge activities with countries from different realities and geographies, such as Japan through a APEC Energy Resident Workshop, and Ecuador through a cooperation agreement between Ministry of Energy. We are organizing webinars on topics associated with the risk reduction, disaster, and increase the resilience of energy infrastructure we both. Also, last week, actively participated in the 7th Regional Platform from Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas and the Caribbean, organized by the United National Officer for the Disaster Risk Reductions, whose main theme was building resilient economies in the Americas and the Caribbean. Those are some examples of the relevance in the shared knowledge activities where countries can participate thanks to the different international institutions. For that reason, we always need to search for ways in terms of innovation and support to help the less developed countries The foregoing taking away always into consideration that each country, based on this geographical and geological character, is affected by the different type of risks.
Thank you very much for those also very interesting responses that really touched upon kind of all aspects of international support, especially as they're spoken about in this venue. So we talked about a marketplace for innovation, so sort of the technology issue, what can we do to make technologies more broadly available, more accessible, the issue of finance, accessibility, how do we use risk finance as well, and also I like this example of sort of needing to integrate the idea of energy resilience within our perhaps broader types of financing, humanitarian operations. How do we integrate the centrality of energy access into those, and also acknowledge perhaps being lucid about the vulnerabilities of systems, this was mentioned, and also acknowledging that there will be risks, and how do we incorporate those in how we respond to shocks and make systems back. And Mr. Lopez sort of talked about cooperation and knowledge exchange, and that leads me sort of to my final question, which is perhaps a bit self-serving for IEA and CDRI, but is really on what can help countries when it comes to sort of these international partnerships. Mr. Lopez has mentioned appreciating being a member of CDRI, other international organizations, other international kind of contexts. How can they sort of support these transitions, and also acknowledging that all countries, this is a challenge for all countries, even though they're at very different levels, and how can this kind of, these sort of mechanisms support different types of countries, whether they're LDCs or whether they're actually high-income countries that also have risk. So just very briefly, your thoughts on that issue.
Thanks, Sarah. I would say that the role is twin. On one hand, there is an advocacy role. On the other hand, there is a technical support role. And I would identify 5 main pillars around which, if we can have some sort of call it a set of principles, or however you frame them. One is really risk analytics as a public good for renewables. Number 2 is looking at energy risk governance for the future, and the whole risk finance thing gets into it, transparency issues, accountability issues. So that's the second pillar. The third would be standards and regulations keep pace with the growth of renewables. Fourth is a global marketplace for technology and innovation. And finally, how do we make it a people's movement? People's participation in resilience building. So along these 5, there are some way, whatever we say, of course there are things for CDRI and IEA to do, but primacy of these efforts will always be at the national and subnational levels. So of these 5, in some areas we have primarily an advocacy role, in other there is a more direct technical support role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, I'd say, obviously, I think the CDRI initiative is an extremely important one. I think the bottom line here is if we don't make these things happen, if we, those countries which have the capability, don't make these things happen, they won't happen, and we will be leaving other countries behind, and that's not going to be good enough. I would also say and acknowledge the leadership of President Biden in the Quad Leaders context earlier this year, where the CDRI initiative and engaging in the Indo-Pacific in this space received high priority. I think that's really important. Again, it's a question, if we don't step up and lead, we will be leaving countries behind, and that's not going to be good enough. I would also say that the work that Australia plans to do on energy supply chain security is not automatically resilience linked, but it is fundamentally, it will underpin resilience in the coming decades. And Australia will be hosting an energy security supply chain summit of principally scientific and technical and private sector experts in the coming year to look at supply chain security issues for countries across the Indo-Pacific region. And for us, it will be extremely important that also takes into account the needs and interests of less developed and least developed countries that we need to bring on board. Thank you.
Regarding the role for supporting transition toward the future energy infrastructure resistant to weather and disaster, the following stands out: the creation of instant to share knowledge programs aimed at promoting sustainable development and the resilience of infrastructure to disaster. For example, the study to enhance the resilience of Odisha's power infrastructure that is being developed by the CDRI after what happened with the cyclone Fani in India, in which we are eager to provide our support together with other institutions such as the World Bank and the Ministry of Power of India. At the same time, I want to thank you. The support of the CDRI is committed to developing a plan to implement a strategy to reduce supply interruption to a last mile connectivity problems, framing this enhancing the resilience of power infrastructure program. Moreover, in the line of knowledge sharing, another example that I want to highlight is the help that the Inter-American Development Bank, in conjunction with OLADE, is working on technical cooperation with countries of the American continent to develop a toolbox of improvement measures to increase length and of infrastructure public services to pandemic aiding the COVID-19 experience of each country. The role of the private sector and academia is clearly relevant in the research and development, with the aim of advancing new technologies, of making technologies more accessible, such as storage technologies that support sustainable development towards carbon neutrality, and that allow expanding universal access to basic services in developed countries. Regarding the support of the private sector, I can give you a specific example of the largest sector in our country, mining. Our Ministry of Mining, with the development of national mining policy, is providing the private sector with guidelines for a series of measures that help to improve the resilience of the sector in the face of the extreme phenomena caused by the climate change. On this line, I want to highlight the work carried out by some mining companies in managing climate risks. For example, Antofagasta Mineral in September of this work of climate change following the recommendation of the TCFD, having a series of measures to reduce water and energy consumption.
No, I know we're wrapping up, and as Minister Singh said, the action is really at the national and the subnational level, so I've enjoyed hearing people who are active in building resilience nationally and their insights. But I did just want to share just a few reflections as we close here. I think much has been made rightly about the regulatory environment or the enabling environment. And this is where I feel that through CDRI, through USAID, we have missions in 80 countries around the world, programs in 100 countries. And so much of what we do is offer that kind of technical assistance. Often it's in creating a more accessible investment climate, looking at domestic resource mobilization. But this needs to be central to our engagement in our missions, to be thinking through what are the regulations and standards that accompany bringing renewables online. I'm thinking specifically about the Power Africa initiative in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's so much energy poverty that we want to offset, bringing renewables online right from the start, leapfrogging these other technologies. But to do that without embedding sufficient attention to resilience would be a big mistake. So I really am looking forward to working with CDRI to think about, again, how we build in attention to, it's a merger really of mitigation and adaptation, sort of living in this space like no other. Second, much has been made, I think at this COP more than any of its predecessors, about the shortage of private sector financing going to adaptation. But I wonder, given that the market has moved so quickly on mitigation financing, and we hope that that's only going to exponentially continue. Whether this, again, is something that can be, I mean, I hope there are more exceptions than this one, but given that private sector finance is already flowing to renewables and to energy transition, whether private sector financing can't be embedded as, a design feature of the deployment of these technologies right from the very beginning, and where this is a kind of nose under the tent when it comes to mobilizing private sector financing, because they're already, moving so rapidly in terms of investments in these renewables, but whether this is something that we shouldn't really focus our private sector engagements on. And then our Chilean friend just mentioned one of the IDBs, but it does seem that if anybody is going to have a role to play in embedding both on the standards side and on the financing side, that the international development banks are a key part of this. And then the last thing I wanted to say, just because I don't think it's come up, is I'm a little, for all of the, again, implied optimism, I think, around this panel and the new attention, the deepened attention to this set of questions and issues, there are some very worrying trends when it comes to insurance companies and their risk tolerance and their thresholds. I think there's, in the property and casualty insurance realm, you're seeing insurance companies, and one can't generalize, but exiting, I think if there's a 2 to 5% flood risk, just exiting the market altogether. And so that's a broader question about insurance period in the adaptation space. But it would seem, again, here that since these transitions are often these technologies are just being brought online, this question of what the public sector relationship is to the insurance sector. I think in Australia, actually, there's been some interesting innovation of creating kind of a pooled fund to try to change the cost-benefit calculus for insurance companies. But I think that dimension of this also in the energy sector specifically, we really have to think through. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Since we only have 5 minutes left, I think I'll just invite people to sort of say some last points, but just to reflect on that last round of interventions. Really interesting to hear about these different roles. There's knowledge sharing, but Mr. Kishore also mentioned this idea of advocacy, and I've been hearing in some other events on these issues, people in local governments saying, it's also something in the energy space that people are not really aware of these issues, and there's still a lot of work to do to bring this to the attention, to make this a key issue. And that might not be generalized in all jurisdictions and all countries. So there's an advocacy role, there's a partnership role. I think the idea Mr. Larsen raised of the leadership role and sort of, people who can act really need to act, and some people acting really has a spillover effect on how that moves forward. So I think that's very important. And a few times this idea of the private sector and how that fits into what we do and how important that is, whether it's through insurance, whether it's through investment, and how these things are built in. And insurance, there might be risks, and then when we look more broadly in green energy transition financing, when it comes to certain countries, we're also seeing some worrying trends and some concerns on where that's going. And so really rethinking the role of public policy in really shaping these things. And I think that's an interesting point. So I'll just ask colleagues to say their final words. Maybe I'll leave Mr. Kishore at the end, coming from CDRI, if you'd like to add words. So maybe let's go with Mr. Larsen and Mr. Lopez, and then Mr. Kishore.
Oh, very quickly, I would say I think how we manage risk is the key, and I absolutely agree with that insurance point. I think that's really important, and it's far from resolved. And we are looking at, just in the Australian context, a very wealthy and advanced economy. I think we are looking at mass disruption to a whole lot of markets over the next 50 years unless we can get that insurance balance right. And that's very much the reference to the work you alluded to on the Australian side. side, and it's clear we need to do that. Otherwise, whole parts of our region will not be able to be the subject of investment. So I think there's the insurance risk issue, and I think also there's the finance risk issue, and it will increasingly be the case, especially for least developed and most exposed nations. It will become very hard to get finance to do the sort of things we're talking about today unless we have a really concerted effort to do so.
Thank you. Just to highlight a very brief idea, the role that collaboration has in terms to have in terms of adaptation and resilience is clear. The collaboration between the public sector, private sector, and academic, and also highlight the role of the public sector to, as you mentioned, Sarah, is to promote and to design public policies in order to be prepared with a focus for the next 40 or 50 years, not only in a short-term policies. It's important that, especially in this kind of area and in the energy sector, we must put the view in 2050 and in 2070 in order to hide long-term policies and to promote the change coming from the private sector, but also from the public sector. Thanks for this space and have the possibility of share this kind of discussion of the adaptation and resilience.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a brilliant panel. I will just say that every year CDRI organizes an international conference on disaster resilient infrastructure. The fourth one will be in 2022, first half. And it's clear to me that we need to enlarge this conversation, and perhaps this theme could be one of the central themes of the next international conference this year. So that's something, so this dialogue has to be carried forward. And more than dialogue, we actually have to get down to actually getting things done on the ground as well. Thank you very much.
Well, I will just close by saying thank you, everyone. And thank you to our audience.